Hey, welcome back to Coach All Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to cite sources for an AP Lang synthesis essay. When introducing sources for your synthesis essay, it can be very tempting to say, according to source A. Now, technically speaking, this isn't wrong and it does count as a citation, but there is a much better way to introduce your source and to cite it that makes your essay read even better. So what should you do instead? I recommend that you embed a short quote into a sentence of your own, and then you include the parenthetical citation at the end. If you've done either MLA citations or APA citations, then chances are you've done an in-text citation, or it might have been called a parenthetical citation. That's exactly what you can do on a synthesis essay as well. Here's an example of what it could look like. This example is based on the locavore prompt, so you can see that the first part of the sentence is the introduction. We don't want to just drop a quote in our essay, we want words before it. That's why we call it embedding the quote. It's when you integrate the quote into a sentence of your own. It can be very jarring to read if somebody starts a sentence with a quote. So the blue portion is the introduction to the quote. The orange portion is the quote itself. And then that teal color at the end where it says source G in parentheses with the period outside, that's the citation. Notice that the period goes outside the parentheses, not inside the quotation marks. That's because your sentence isn't over until after you've included your citation. So this is one way to not only integrate evidence, but also to avoid the phrase according to source A, or whatever the source is. Now let's talk about another way that you can avoid that according to source A introduction. So one thing to consider is that each of these sources came from somewhere else. And so because of that, you can actually introduce your selected quote by providing the relevant credentials of the original source. Let me show you what that would look like. So here's an example from that same locavore prompt. You can see that instead of saying according to source B, in this case, it says according to Marion Nestle. So I've included the person's name, and then I've actually also included that person's credentials. In this case, it was provided in the passage. However, sometimes you can use the information at the top of the passage. There's going to be a box where it gives you the citation and also an italicized sentence that tells you where the source came from. Sometimes that information can help you figure out the credentials of the source as well. So just like with the previous example, the dark blue there introduces the cited evidence. The orange is the quote itself, and then we have the citation at the end. Again, the period goes outside the parentheses. Now you might be wondering, what about a visual text? You're guaranteed at least one visual text among your sources. Sometimes the College Board even includes two. A visual text can be a photo, a chart, a graph, a cartoon, anything that's not a written passage. When going over a visual text in class, I ask my students to do bullet points at the bottom of the source, and I ask them what conclusions can they draw from the source itself. So for instance, if it is a cartoon, perhaps they can figure out the true meaning of the cartoon. So we don't necessarily want to refer to the cartoon itself. We don't want to refer to the animals in the cartoon, but we want to ask ourselves, okay, what's the message of the cartoon? What is the cartoonist actually trying to get people to think about here? If it's a chart or a graph, then their bullet point might be numerical data. Sometimes the charts or graphs are very easy to read and you can get the percentages to compare. Other times you might have to just make inferences. So depending on what the visual text looks like, you might actually be able to quote it in terms of dialogue from a cartoon or specific percentages, or you can just paraphrase the information. Here's an example of what that might look like. You can see that this format looks very similar to the previous examples. The difference is that this is a paraphrase. It doesn't have any directly quoted evidence. So in this case, we don't have any of the orange font that I've been using for the quote. You have the blue, which is the sentence itself, and then the teal, which is the citation. As with the previous example, the citation still comes at the end and the period goes outside the second parenthesis.